afternoon and a very warm welcome to this webinar organized by Nehru Memorial Museum and Library on a very topical subject, Afghanistan, Taliban, and the region. We have the pleasure of having with us today an expert on Afghanistan, Dr. Vishal Chandra, who is a research fellow at IDSA, New Delhi, and has been working on this subject for more than 20 years. So, a very warm welcome to you, Vishal,
Thank
uh,
you.
webinar, and I welcome all members of the audience, all participants who are present here in the hall and also online. Uh, we know that Afghanistan is in the news once again, and for all the wrong reasons. After 20 years, America has America and its allies have once again decided to leave Afghanistan to its fate, or rather to the fate that awaits Afghanistan with the presence of and with the dominance of Taliban there. So it is undoubtedly one of the most important geopolitical events in the current times, which is going to have far-reaching repercussions for the entire region and potentially the world. And certainly, India is one of those countries that are going to be very seriously affected by this development in a variety of ways. And what is even more worrisome is that as compared to the other players, the neighbors, and as compared to them, for example, Russia, China, Pakistan, now, with the departure of America and its allies in Afghanistan, India has very few options. Our leverage with the Taliban regime, which is there now in Afghanistan, is comparatively limited. On the other hand, the problems that might arise from the presence of Taliban in Afghanistan because of our relations with Pakistan and with other countries, they are potentially very serious. Terrorism, of course, is the most important, but even short of terrorism, this radicalization of certain elements of our country and also in the neighborhood is a very important and a very serious concern. So, for all these reasons, of course, we have to study Afghanistan and we have to understand and analyze how things are unfolding. And for that, today, as I said, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Vishal Chandra with us. So, without further delay, now I would like to invite Dr. Vishal Chandra to go ahead with his lecture.
Thank you, Chair. Uh, First of all, I'd like to thank Nehru Memorial for inviting me to share my personal views, my observations about some recent developments in Afghanistan. And namaskar and a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to do is I'll make some broad observations to begin with, and perhaps more could be taken up if there's a Q&A session after my presentation. Well, since this is a very informal gathering, so I don't think I really need to go into the details of the developments that have taken place last 3 weeks in Afghanistan. We all have seen the visuals from Kabul airport, and the sense one gets is as if no one wants to stay in Afghanistan. So initially, I thought that perhaps it's the educated lot which benefited from the international engagement last almost 2 decades. It's they who are leaving, and because they were targeted systematically, particularly since May this year, and of course before as well, as conflict moved from rural areas to the urban areas. But then as time passed by, when one saw a sea of humanity, emerging at the Kabul airport, families with small babies, with children, somewhere we all realized that perhaps it's not just the educated lot, it's not just the people who have worked closely with the government or the Western forces or the Western media or Western NGOs or members of the or relatives of the members of the armed forces of Afghanistan. It's the other Afghanistan as well, because people came from provinces. As the provincial capitals started falling one by one, starting I think August 6th, people initially moved to the provincial capitals, and then they moved to Kabul, thinking that being capital, it's supposed to be the most secure of all places in Afghanistan. But then we saw morning of August 15 how president and the senior members of his government left the country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to look at developments in Afghanistan in a more nuanced manner, because Afghanistan is at a crossroads, and we are talking of a country which has seen instability, several rounds of conflict and turmoil last 40 years, over 40 years. So we are talking of a very different society here, a very different country here. I think we need not, let me begin by saying that we need not always look at the developments in Afghanistan or developments around it in absolute terms, in black and white, especially when we are aware that it's a tormented society, a tormented nation. It has seen 2 rounds of external armed interventions in the last 40 years. With the recent one, we all saw how it ended. And so it's a conflict which involves almost 3 generations of Afghans with varying perceptions about state authority, because the old structures were long gone. The relationship that was there between state and society, state and people, or let's say center and provinces, was destroyed back in 1980s. And since then, Afghanistan has been struggling to have a sustainable balance of power within the country. In fact, while working on Afghanistan, I'm often reminded of a 1971 Hindi film, Kal, Aaj aur Kal, because one cannot look at developments that we are seeing right now independent of what happened back in the 80s and 90s, beginning with the Soviet invasion in 79. Now, the conflict over the decades has acquired several overlapping layers and dimensions, turning this small, underdeveloped, landlocked country of roughly 35 million people into a complex multi-generational challenge right at the heart of Asia. We all keep hearing about the strategic location of Afghanistan. Somewhere we need to bear in mind that all the major ethnicities of Afghanistan, they have their co-ethnics living right across their national borders. Be it Pashtuns, there are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than in Afghanistan. Then you've got Tajiks up in the northeast, and Uzbeks, Turkmens, Hazaras in central Afghanistan. Except for Hazaras, all the major ethnicities, they have their co-ethnics living right across the borders. And if you put all the the minor ethnicities, ethnic groups together, they are supposed to be more than the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. Now, this conflict, has seen, as I said, 2 rounds of international intervention, and both the interventions were fronted by their regional allies, seeking to superimpose, secure, or resource, regimes in Kabul, with the rest of the neighbors playing one or all sides, and depending on the course of developments, working towards the decimation of Afghan state structures and authority. So Afghanistan, to most of its neighbors, if not all, is more of a nuisance. And I'm saying this based on my interaction during international conferences and other fora. It's more of a security nightmare to most of its neighbors, and it often doesn't leave neighbors with too many options. Interestingly, though, Afghan state or the people of Afghanistan have never been a threat to anyone, to any country in the neighborhood. While several efforts have been made to bring about national reconciliation, and I'm not just referring to efforts post 2001 or let's say post 2009 and 10, after President Obama came out with his Af-Pak strategy in March 2009. Even before 2001, several rounds of efforts were made to try and bring various groups together. But then you see, all these efforts failed simply because they somewhere ignored deliberately or trivialized the potential threat coming from east of the Durand line. So somewhere they failed to acknowledge the key source of political disruption or socio-political turmoil in the country that was coming from across the Durand line from Pakistan. Now, I'll fast forward to February 2020 agreement between the United States and the Taliban, because somewhere, if you look at be it the February 2020 agreement or other agreements back in the 90s, they all were notably indifferent as much to the future as to the past of Afghanistan. And this is precisely why February 2020 agreement too failed to bring about intra-Afghan negotiations and reconciliation, as there were four components to it. The third was intra-Afghan negotiation. The first was security guarantees. So we saw in February 2020, a Haqqani Taliban terrorist network with most of its members sanctioned by the UN and US, entering into an agreement with a reigning superpower, a major democracy. And that was a huge signal not only to the Taliban, Haqqani, and their affiliates in the region and other Islamist militants active in the region, but to the people of Afghanistan, to the Afghan administration at the provincial level, to the district level, to the Afghan armed forces most of all. Because as part of this agreement, and this agreement was preceded by almost 18 months of negotiations, direct negotiations in Qatar, where Taliban have maintained their office formally since 2013. So as per this agreement, Afghan government was never a part of these negotiations, but they were expected to release 5,000 hardcore militants from their prisons, which included not only Taliban elements and Haqqani members of the Haqqani network, but also some foreign militant groups. Why foreign militant groups in Afghanistan? Very quickly, I think, again, I'll take you back to 2014. This was the time when Islamic State was coming up in Iraq and parts of Syria, and Western forces were ending their combat mission. They were vacating the forward operating bases along the Durand line. Now, that was the time when Pakistan Army launched Operation Zarb-e-Azb in its tribal agencies. So what they did during these operations, they pushed all these foreign fighters inside Afghanistan. So all these foreign fighters, along with their families, they crossed over and they settled down in Nangarhar, Kunar, all these provinces, Afghan provinces bordering the tribal agencies of Pakistan. But for the first time, they got a foothold in Badakhshan, which is northeastern corner of Afghanistan, which shares border with Tajikistan, POK, and there's this chicken neck Wakhan corridor connecting Afghanistan to China. Afghanistan has the shortest border with its perhaps the largest neighbor there. So Badakhshan has been in the news for a long time because of the presence of assortment of foreign fighters there. So the structures that are responsible, and this is the tragedy of Afghanistan, and this is going to be a major challenge in times to come, especially for us, and not just for us again, but for Russians and Chinese too, because the structures that are responsible for sustained violence and political disruption in Afghanistan, they remain intact east of the Durand line in Pakistan. Now, despite several assurances made by the Taliban in February 2020 deal, foreign terrorist groups, they continue to operate within Afghanistan. And recently, Taliban spokesperson in response to a question said, well, yes, as per the agreement, we are not going to allow them to threaten the security of United States and its allies or the neighboring countries, but the agreement doesn't stop us from having relations with them. Now, 4 decades of war. That means many of these militant organizations, these extremist networks, they have not only settled in areas along the Duran line on both Pakistan and Afghan side, but they have also married into each other. So they are matrimonial alliances, familial ties among members of Al-Qaeda and Taliban and Haqqani network and some foreign militant networks as well. Uh, if I try and broaden the regional canvas, at the beginning of my presentation, I think, the regional responses are still largely driven by cold calculations. And somewhere, we find that most of the regional countries, and that constrains us in a very effective manner, in the sense that there's a lot of tolerance for state-sponsored proxy activities in our region. Now, assuming, ladies and gentlemen, that we have to deal with the situation as it is, I think it is we should rather avoid being very judgmental at this stage. I think it will be any time better to take a more nuanced view of the evolving scenario in and around Afghanistan. For Taliban, as we know today, may not be there in the current form in times to come, and sooner than later, or groups within or without might realign and morph into something else, opening an altogether new, or a rather familiar, chapter of alliance politics and resource competition in and around Afghanistan. So obviously we don't have to take the statements that are coming from Taliban at face value, but definitely we need to take a more nuanced view, because we have to deal with this environment. We cannot afford to let threats come to Delhi and then we'll deal with it. I think we need to find ways to deal with it away from the borders, while we strengthen our security mechanisms within the country. I think I would also like to argue that Taliban is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan as a this is again, we need to bear in mind, because we are a neighbor of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan as a geocultural space is much larger and too diverse to be any country's strategic backyard. Similarly, it is too much for any over-centralized authoritarian structure in Kabul to sustain its monopoly over power dynamics at subnational levels for far too long. A lot is being said about the new version of Taliban. That's something which Pakistanis have for quite some time been telling to the world, that these are new and civilized Taliban. These are different from the 1990s. So where exactly do they differ? At least in terms of projection, the way they are projecting themselves, I think that we need to again understand. I think one major difference is that Taliban today are not willing to suffer isolation. Back in the 90s, they had two major challenges. One was a lack of international recognition, and second was lack of international aid and assistance. But this time around, it seems that they have realigned their tactics, their approach. Their ideology remains fundamentally the same. They cannot afford to make too many compromises when it comes to ideology, and that has more to do with the intergenerational gap. Because if there's a post-2001 generation in big cities that came up in big cities of Afghanistan, Kabul, Herat, Mazar Sharif, who benefited from the international presence and engagement, Taliban too have a generation of fighters who have not seen cities before, and they were entering Afghan cities for the first time, and to them it was an altogether different world. And there are stories of how they have been taking selfies with the multi-story buildings, malls behind them, and how some of them are bringing their families just to show them that this is how Kabul looks like. So to them, it's a very different. The urban Afghanistan is very different. Then I think that largely explains their communications strategy and their policy projections. and especially their communication strategy in terms of public outreach through various forums, including social media. If you look at their website, I think it was always far better updated, more systematic than the Afghan government websites. And they have made good on diplomatic outreach that was there from the neighboring countries, initiatives taken by some of the Afghanistan's neighboring countries. So the current version of Taliban, or let's say a section of leadership sitting in Doha, which includes several of their senior leaders, including Mullah Baradar, who was deputy to the Afghan founder of the Afghan movement, Mullah Omar, and who was arrested in 2010 but released by Pakistan in 2018 to take the US Taliban talks forward. I think the section sitting in Doha is very different from the section operating from Quetta in Pakistan, because the elements that are there in Doha, they are projecting a completely different, a very mild version of Taliban, ready to reconcile kind of a posturing has been on for quite some time. But they are definitely more sensitized about the kind of audience they are addressing, or have a more differentiated approach whereby they put on a moderate face when interacting with a wider international, regional, or Western audience. But the same is reflected, appears, I mean, that's my interpretation again, but the same differentiated approach is reflected when it comes to their conduct in cities and the vast rural spaces, which is away from the international gaze in Afghanistan. Apart from successfully capitalizing on the various platforms or increased interactions they now have at the broader regional and extra-regional levels, I think somewhere they have realized that diplomacy, while diplomacy is important, and they need a set of trained, skilled, articulate voices to travel to places and put across their point. But when it comes to rural Afghanistan, their policies are different. And this is where I think an understanding has evolved over a period of time between the older generation of Taliban, who have realized the value of diplomacy, the need to reach out to the international community, and the younger, more the more hardcore sections of Taliban, which is more dominant and which is bigger, and which is controlled by their military commanders. Because the people sitting in Doha, they are not military commanders. They're more of political leaders. But then I'm not very sure if it's going to be very easy for the sections of the old leadership to sell this idea of having a very inclusive Islamic government or an inclusive Islamic emirate, as they have been talking about. So this could be a source of tension and conflict, and especially within Taliban, or let's say between various groups. The Taliban, unlike in the 90s, now they have many groups within among them. So you've got Haqqanis who were integrated by Pakistan's ISI into the leadership structures of the Taliban in 2006, when their leader Mullah Akhtar Mansour was killed in a drone strike while crossing from Iran to Balochistan. He was killed in a drone strike, in American drone strike at that point of time. And before that, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, and I'm sure some of you must be aware, some conflict had taken place among sections of, among various factions of Taliban in Quetta, when the news reports about Mullah Omar having died in 2013 became public. And when it came to electing a new leader, there was a conflict in 2015. There were reports of open skirmishes, firing, etc. among various Afghan factions, and Akhtar Mansour was badly injured during these skirmishes among factions of the Taliban. So there are fault lines, there are divisions, and these fault lines and divisions are likely to emerge. They will sharpen up as they try to take policy decisions, as they try to set out structures of governance, as they start working on a draft constitution. So there are issues which are going to be very challenging for the older generation of Taliban leaders. Interestingly, Taliban have also, they're very conscious of the environment this time. Again, this is a major difference from the 1990s. They are showing a sense of history. And I'm talking of the sections of the older leadership, because you see, if you look at the founders of the Taliban, the senior leaders, they all were rooted in the anti-Soviet jihad back in the 1980s. They have emerged from there, in 1994. So they have a broader experience and a better understanding based on the experience from the 90s as to how they need to deal not only with the diversity of Afghanistan, but with the varying political perceptions around Afghanistan. So they are going to use these, regional fault lines to their advantage, because for them it's more of a political survival to begin with before they go about seeking international recognition. In fact, I'm not talking about it because it is something which we will have to wait and watch once their government is formed. And it's a long technical process because several members of the Haqqani network, several members of the Taliban are under UN sanctions list and United States US sanctions list as well. In fact, interestingly, Taliban are banned in Russia. And if you follow Russian media, when Taliban delegation would visit Moscow and would meet their foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, or any other senior official, while reporting, almost all the Russian media would specifically mention within brackets that Taliban is a banned organization. So, well, that is a different story altogether. But Taliban have, again, to differentiate from the 1990s, they seem to be making a conscious effort to avoid entangling themselves into regional conflict around them, rather seeking to benefit from it. No statements have been issued against any of the neighboring country per se, and on a couple of occasions when questions were asked about their position on Kashmir, they were very specific, and very recently again they came out very clear on that issue. They said that it's an issue between India and Pakistan. Keep us out of Kashmir. We are not part of it. It's for India and Pakistan to settle the issue among themselves. And the same could be said about conflicts that Iranians have with Saudi or the US and Russia. They have somewhere avoided getting into it because their focus is more on consolidating their hold, dealing with the governance issues, because this is some time back, their deputy leader, Mullah Barada, very clearly said that governance is going to be a major challenge. And they would be requiring international aid and investment, and that explains the outreach to most of the regional countries, including India. And here I would like to mention that President Biden and his Secretary of State and other senior officials of his administration, last 2-3 days, they have been saying that we have extensive economic leverages over the Taliban because they still have their citizens, 100 to 200. We too have some of the Indian nationals still in Afghanistan. So evacuation definitely is a major concern for now for most of the countries. But United States, the US Treasury had blocked the reserve assets of the Afghan central bank. Now, there's a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan with thousands of Afghans internally displaced, or they have lost their livelihoods, they have lost their jobs. And since there has been a lot of focus on what was happening at Kabul airport, I would like to mention that thousands of Afghans, they had moved to the border crossing points, thousands of them, trying to cross over into Pakistan or Iran. But if you look at the ground offensive of the Taliban, especially July and August, they started off by capturing the bordering provinces, basically encircling Kabul. They took control of the key border crossing points through which land trade used to take place. So somewhere, perhaps they know that international recognition is going to come, is going to take time. So somewhere, I think it was part of their strategy to ensure that there is a flow of funds, because a lot of revenue comes through the land trades. It's a landlocked country, and to a large extent, the Afghan economy is dependent on trade with the neighboring countries, especially Iran and Pakistan. So I think as part of an understanding with these two neighbors, they ensured that there is no refugee influx in these two countries, and these two countries have been opposed to the idea of having refugees. Same goes for Russian, same goes for the Central Asian republics, same goes for the Turkey. None of them want to have refugees, more refugees, because there are already a couple of millions of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, in Iran. So we'll have to wait and watch how they are going to deal with the humanitarian crisis. But that certainly gives a lot of leverage to the Western countries and to the international community at large. Now, we also will have to wait and see. I don't like using this phrase wait and watch, but as I said earlier, conflicts in Afghanistan often doesn't leave its neighbors with too many options. So I think somewhere we'll have to see to what extent Taliban are willing to get down to the basics of economics and economy, and also international politics. Projection is one thing. We all understand why they are making such projections, projecting a milder version of Taliban. They seem to be ceding spaces which they refuse to the opposing groups inside Afghanistan. They refuse to talk to. They've been pretty consistent about their demands, their objectives: a pure Islamic government and end of foreign occupation, and no talks with the Afghan government, the elected government, which was there in Kabul. And apart from seeing whether they get down to the basics of economics, I think what is more important is to see to what extent they're able to reconcile to the social and political diversity of the country, the various identities that define Afghanistan. Also, whether they will be able to act as a bridge between various Afghanistans, not just the rural and urban divide that is there normally in most of the traditional societies, ancient societies. We understand these things far better than perhaps the Americans or most of the European countries. But in a lighter vein, this is something that would require some Roshan Khayals and a lot of Roshan Khayali, and a national vision which goes beyond their narrow ideological lens. So I think it's going to be a major test for the leadership of the Taliban, because there's a strong element, there's a strong favor of Haqqanis as far as the Taliban negotiations are concerned with other groups that are on in Kabul or maybe in Kandahar too, because the leaders have descended, in Kandahar. There are reports suggesting that the Taliban Amirul Mominin is now in Kandahar, and he's expected to announce, or he would depute someone to announce the formation of the government. So we'll have to wait and see how inclusive are they going to be. I think from our point of view, it will be better if it is an inclusive government, because if they get elements from the previous government, since they are talking to some of them, so I think we'll have some, as we say in Hindi, a silsila basically, to keep to keep the doors open. But at the same time, we need to remember that we still have thousands of Afghans in India. And I'm not just talking about Afghans who were evacuated on 6-month emergency visa. I'm talking about Afghans who came here on scholarship programs. There are thousands of Afghan students, male and female, studying at our universities, at our institutions. Afghans who are here for medical treatment. Afghans who came here before July and August on various training programs that we conduct for them. So overall, it's a very dynamic scenario at the moment. So a little wait and watch is required. But at the same time, I think sooner or later we will have to make some moves. There are already reports of some communication. You see, in Afghanistan, back channels are always open. Everyone is talking to everyone. That's how I would like to put it. So over to you, Chair. Thank you for your, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind attention. I'd be happy to listen to your comments, to your suggestions, and I'd be happy to take any queries, from the audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vishal Chandra, for this very comprehensive and enlightening lecture on the current situation in Afghanistan and how we have come to this point. We are now open to questions and brief comments from all the participants. थोड़ा इसको बड़ा करिए. There is a question. Thank you for mentioning rural Afghanistan. Concerns are mostly publicized by the urban elite. Do the Taliban enjoy support in rural Afghanistan? What do they offer to the citizens there? Can you hear?
Yeah, I got the question. I think
let's take a couple of questions. Let's take a couple of questions.
Yeah,
then
at least 2-3 questions. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead with your question.
My point is, what options does India have? Thank you.
Okay.
I shall repeat. What options does India have in the present scenario and in the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Okay. We have heard you, Mr. Upadhyay. Any other question?
Okay, I'll try and answer these two then. Are there more questions, Chair?
No, please, you go ahead.
Okay, I think two very interesting questions. Do Taliban enjoy support? Well, what we have seen the last couple of weeks is actually, the rural Afghanistan coming to the fore. There has been a lot of focus on what the government in Kabul has been saying, what the educated elites of Afghanistan, have been saying. But the vast rural spaces, tend to be largely ignored, and because the narrative usually flows from the educated elites, the English-speaking elite who came to Afghanistan post 2001. So I think what we have seen is the emergence of the other Afghanistan, the Afghanistan that lives in vast rural spaces, vast rural tracts in valleys, because we are talking of a country which is 80% mountainous. So I think as a neighbor, we have to look beyond. We should be able to look beyond Afghanistan, and we should be able to discern the various dynamics that define the social and political life outside Kabul. So I think this is, I think I have reflected on, how Taliban, the young Taliban fighters, they came to the cities. And this is, you see, photography was banned in 1990s. It was considered as un-Islamic back then. But now you have a very media-savvy Taliban. They take selfies. They have social media accounts, and they have effectively used it as well as part of their communication strategy, unlike the Taliban. Well, there was no social media then, but they avoided being photographed. They avoided giving interviews. I think that Taliban have not only drawn lessons from their experience from the 1990s, but also from the fate of the Islamic State, because they saw Islamic State coming and then going at the same time. But Islamic State had a very effective communication, a media strategy, let's say. I think so that explains somewhere their outreach, because Islamic State chief al-Baghdadi had questioned the authority, the credibility of Taliban leader Mullah Omar, saying that he has no right to call himself Amirul Mu'minin, which means leader of the faithful. So he was questioning the moral authority of the Taliban, and that explains the rift, ideological rift between the Taliban and the Islamic State. So, well, I didn't speak much about Islamic State here, but I think I need to. The Afghanistan chapter of Islamic State, it mainly comprises of former Afghan and former Pakistani Taliban. It's a mix, and they have some Arab foreign fighters in their ranks, and they're mainly concentrated in Kunar and Nangarhar province, especially Nangarhar at the moment, which borders Pakistan's tribal agencies. And but then, 2 3 days back, when 2 days back on 30th, uh, when U.S. CENTCOM commander General McKenzie was giving a media briefing at Pentagon, he said that there are 2,000, Islamic State fighters in Afghanistan. Now, Taliban, they have 60, 70, there are various estimates, but anytime they outnumber the Islamic State fighters in Afghanistan. But then he said Taliban will have a tough time dealing with them. Now that raises a question: why is it going to be so difficult for the Taliban to deal with Islamic State, which basically again operates from the rural areas, but they are very good, very effective when it comes to conducting attacks, suicide attacks in the urban spaces of Afghanistan. And they are using the same tactics which Taliban were using against the Afghan government, or the tactics that Mujahideen were using against the Soviets or the communist PDPA regime back in the 1980s. Because they a couple of years back, they were part of the Afghan Taliban or Pakistani Taliban. But then the Afghan Taliban leader was never visible. They never saw him. That's one aspect of the post 2001 Taliban, young Taliban fighters. They never saw their leader. They never heard from him. So obviously, Mullah Omar's existence was being questioned, and there was a level of disgruntlement. There were reports coming in, if I remember correctly, 2008 and 9 or 10 onwards, where there was restlessness among the young Taliban fighters as to why we don't get to see our leader Amirul Mominin, or we don't get to hear from him. So as Islamic State came up in 2014, they established their Afghanistan or Khorasan chapter, as they call it, which is a historical name. For in the later half of 2014, several of these Taliban, they joined Islamic State. They replaced the flag, but somewhere, there was this realization as Islamic State fell in Iraq, they don't have much of a future. And they are vastly outnumbered by the Taliban and Haqqani network. So I believe there are sections of ISKP, it's a very dispersed group, and there are sections of ISKP which acts as a front for the Taliban Haqqani network. And there are sections which do not want to deal with the Taliban because their political future lies in opposing the Taliban. So maybe in years to come, we might see more, Taliban joining, because they have been extremely critical of Afghan Taliban leadership taking a softer line, reaching out to United States, talking to them, and they believe that the Taliban leadership is now under a lot of foreign influence, and they won't be able to establish the kind of Sharia-based Islamic system that they want. So there are ideological issues, there are issues involving their interests, vested interests. You see, when we are looking at these terrorist networks, whether it's on east of Durand Line or west of Durand Line, they all have evolved as multinational industries. They are corporations now, and they are vested interests. So ideology definitely matters here, because it is rooted in anti-Westernism. Anything that is Western, they don't mind using their automatic assault rifles. They want to fly their Black Hawks, use the drones left behind. But at the same time, when it comes to policy, when it comes to articulation of ideas or ideology, it is very well rooted in, that's a separate debate why it's rooted in anti-Westernism. That's a separate theological debate altogether, a historical debate too. Second question was, one more thing. You see, the kind of policy that the Taliban have, it gels to an extent with the Pashtun code of conduct, the tribal code of conduct, more in the southern and eastern pockets of the country. And this is where, because people anyway are conservative in the rural countryside, in hinterlands. It's something we all can understand, because we often face the same dilemma in our own society. So the kind of policies that they are talking about may not be very new, maybe little stricter forms, but it's not new to the people in the conservative rural Pashtun belts of Afghanistan. And lastly, where is the alternative? People in these areas, they have not known government for the last 3 decades. They don't know what is a government. So Taliban, there is no alternative to the Taliban as far as, and a 3 generation of Afghans. Let's talk about the last two. They were born during the wars, and all they have seen is conflict around themselves. And having a bike and with a gun on the shoulder, that's the only thing they have seen, and that's the only thing they want in the rural areas of Afghanistan.
If I may interrupt you, one more question has come up. This is from Dr. S.K. Pachori. He wants to know as to what is the general reaction of the public regarding the fleeing of the head of state. How do they see it?
That's a very good question. See, people there have a strong sense of abandonment because no one could forecast the sudden fall of the Afghan state. Before President Ghani and his senior members of his government left Kabul on the morning of August 15, I think he had addressed the people of Afghanistan. It was a televised address, I think 24 hours before, on 14, maybe it was recorded on 13, where he was talking about regrouping the Afghan armed forces and taking on the Taliban. So somewhere there was a lot of disconnect between the Afghan, and a couple of days before, early August, he had replaced his his army chief. And this was the second time he was replacing his army chief within a couple of months. And that itself shows the leadership crisis within the Afghan armed forces, the disconnect between the Afghan government and the armed forces, and the leadership of the Afghan National Army and its regional corps. You see, this is an army which had taken huge casualties. Now, they could not have surrendered all of a sudden because, again, when Americans started talking to the Taliban directly and the Afghan government was forced to release, though they were not part of the 18-month-long negotiations, they were not involved at any stage. They were systematically kept out, marginalized, and increasingly isolated because neighboring countries too were reaching out to the Taliban. So when Afghan government was made to release 5,000 prisoners in exchange for 1,000, and when they had to release some of the hardcore, because many of them within months went back to the battlefield. So that was perhaps a message to the Afghan administration at the provincial and district levels, and a message to the armed forces. Secondly, I think we also need to understand again how social network operates in Afghanistan, because probably the power brokers at the local level played a very important role in ensuring surrender of the government machinery at the provincial level, surrender by Afghan forces, because they didn't know what to defend. The government was isolated, and it was somewhere quite known that this government may not be able to survive once the American air power goes away. So perhaps a very negative message went down to the administration. That explains why governors, in lieu of and Taliban played very, it was part of their strategy.
If I may just
give them the option of having a safe passage, provided they surrender the treasury and the weaponry.
If I may just add to this question only, because you have talked about a few things which are of course of interest to me as well. You are saying that probably it's the local chieftains, the locally influential people who played a very important role in ensuring the surrender of the Afghan army, and the Afghan army didn't know what to defend. Several questions arise here. Was it the local deals or a larger deal to which the Americans were also a party, of course, and the kind of deal which has been in the making for the last many years, which resulted in this kind of melt away of the Afghan army. Melt away is the right word, because to the best of my knowledge, the Afghan army has hardly fought. And this was an army which was a diverse army. It was trained by the Americans and the Allies for almost 20 years, and it was supposed to be a professional army. I could understand if the army had fought against the Taliban and been defeated by them. But so far as I can see, they have not fought except in very
That, that's a very valid and very interesting question. You see, that's why I refer to the role of
no.
power brokers.
So let me just
Okay.
complete this. So this is one point of it. So it seems like that there is it's a part of a larger deal.
Yeah.
And of course, if you look at the history of Afghanistan again, you see the very nature of tribal and militia warfare is such. It's a battle, psychological battle, as you say. Once a militia realizes, or once a tribe realizes that the other party has now become overwhelmingly strong, then the armies suddenly surrender. But as long as they have hope and they have conviction, they can of course fight fiercely. So this is what the equation seems to be. I would like to get your comments on this.
I think that's a very valid question, and I was coming to that. You see, there were secret clauses to the US-Pakistan agreement, sorry, US-Taliban agreement, which was signed on February 29, 2020. Those clauses or annexures were never made public. So I too have a feeling that it was, you see, the way they isolated the Afghan government, the way they were marginalized, and the way they were forced to surrender 5,000 militants, release them from their prisons, because that's the only leverage that the Afghan government had. And the way American Special Envoy, Ambassador Khalilzad, was continuously on tour, traveling to regional capitals, to Beijing, to Moscow, to countries in West Asia as well, and to NATO countries. I think there was a certain understanding between US and Pakistan and Taliban, because you see these 1.5 year talks, somewhere Pakistan saw a space, or let's say Rawalpindi saw a space to change their roles, in the sense, while they continue to support Taliban, materially and diplomatically, politically, in every way. But at the same time, they quietly moved into the role of a peace facilitator. And US dependence continued to increase because President Trump was bent on ending what they call a forever war. So after taking a very hard stance back in 2017, when President Trump came up with his Afghanistan and South Asia strategy, he makes a U-turn end of the same year. And I'm sure you would remember, 31st of December and 1st January night, he tweeted, saying that these Pakistanis, they have fooled us for 15 years. And we have spent billions of dollars. If I remember correctly, he gave some amount also, $35 billion or something. And they have made a fool of us. And they continue to train those very people who kill our troops across this side of the Duran line. But then again, he takes a U-turn thereafter and writes a letter. There were reports that he wrote a letter to Imran Khan and basically reached out to seek the help in getting Taliban at the negotiating table. I think they gave up on the Afghan government in 2018 and 19. Because before that, if one goes back to 2010, 11, 12, that was the time when they first, got in touch with the Taliban, and that is how the Taliban office in Qatar, in Doha, came up. At that point of time, and later, before 2018, they were continuously trying to convince Taliban that they need to talk to the Afghan government. So they were trying to play the role of a facilitator, a mediator. But by 2018, and since Trump made it very clear that this war has to end.
And let us not forget the role that Hamid Karzai seems to be playing in this entire course of events. I mean, he is there in Afghanistan, and Karzai was in power in Afghanistan till 2014. And he still has a lot of leverage with many parties in Afghanistan, including with Taliban and, of course, with the Americans. And he seems to be one of those players there. So what I'm trying to suggest is, And as you also agree that there are more things there, than meet the eye, certainly, because such a large army simply melting away. And I read reports that the army did not have rations. So now this is the situation impossible to understand. After America and its allies pumping so much money into Afghanistan, how is it possible that they did not even have rations, and because they were starving, they surrendered before the Taliban? All this obviously leads to this suspicion which we have discussed. Related to this, of course, is another question which comes to my mind. You have, of course, mentioned that we have to take a very, very nuanced way of the situation. Taliban is not what it used to be 20 years ago. Now they have changed in so many ways. They are more media savvy now. They are trying to make a better projection, at least, because they have realized that they need international aid, they need international recognition, and of course, for development and just for maintaining government, they need support of various people from within Afghanistan and also from different parts of the world, at least from the influential countries. So, because of all these reasons, and because of the fact that they have learned their lessons, their behavior might be better now. This is what you seem to be suggesting, and I don't doubt, the sort of, the point that you are making. I agree with it, but the only thing that comes to my mind is that as a radical and fundamentalist movement, which is rooted in the idea of jihad, which started in this region in the 1980s, and the entire imagination, the network, etc., of the Taliban, which is rooted in a highly radical version of Islam and highly ahistorical version of Islam. As we know that whenever such movements try to become moderate, the problem that confronts them is that the internal contradictions of these movements, they lead to their implosion. And obviously then there are internal fights, internal conflicts, because obviously there will be a large number of the members of the Taliban who will feel that the moderate ones are betraying somehow the cause for which they and their sort of forefathers or their predecessors have fought for the last 30, 40 years. So how would that because it's not simply about my intentions or desire that a radical movement like Taliban can transform itself and become sort of an acceptable member of the international community in some sense. How will it overcome all these contradictions? And second problem there is that even if Taliban wants to come, will Pakistan allow it to do that? What is the leverage that Pakistan has with Taliban? And now with Pakistan-China nexus, this BRI, of course, might reach Afghanistan. And China might also usually enter into some sort of a deal along with Pakistan, with Taliban, because it is, of course, definitely in the interest of Pakistan to keep the Afghan pot boiling. But China is also involved. So, what will be your response in the light of this situation?
Uh, well, this is exactly what I said at the beginning of my presentation, that a section of older generation of Taliban leaders have realized the value of diplomacy because they were rooted in the Mujahideen movement of the 1980s. They have a wider experience, a much broader, experience, and they may have realized the value of diplomacy. And that's where I felt that they are. That's why they're projecting a very, they're taking a very flexible position. But at the same time, I said it's going to be very difficult for them to convince the idea of having a very inclusive Islamic Emirate, or the idea of having a more flexible approach that is bound to, as I said, lead to internal frictions within the Taliban, and divisions within the Taliban will sharpen. It will increase as they go about setting governance, administration, as they go about segregating power, as they go about defining their policies, as they go about drafting a new constitution. So all these are going to be a very contentious issue for the senior leadership of the Taliban, and I'm keeping Haqqanis out of it. I'm talking of the old leadership of the Taliban back from the 1990s, which is at the helm at the moment. Whether they will be able to build consensus or not, that is what we will have to wait and watch. And there is every possibility, as I said, that factions within the Taliban and some groups outside, they might morph into something else. And the Taliban, as we know them today, may not be there in their current form. So obviously, these are very relevant points which we will have to wait and watch. And there will be I'm sure there's a lot of churning within, because you see Haqqani, we all have seen photographs of former President Hamid Karzai or Dr. Abdullah talking to the Taliban, but actually those are the people talking to them are Haqqani network people. They are not exactly Taliban. And if you look at the security that has been put in place in Kabul, that entire security structure is dominated by the Haqqanis. So Haqqanis somewhere are acting as go-between, Rawalpindi and that section of the Taliban leadership, which has been sitting in Doha, projecting a very moderate face. So there will be internal power struggle, because now they are controlling, almost all the provinces except for Panjshir. But Panjshir is a separate story here. So, and all the eastern provinces, they come under Mullah, I'm forgetting them, Sirajuddin Haqqani, who was integrated into the Taliban leadership structure by Pakistan in 2016. Now, and the southern parts of western Afghanistan are under the command of Mullah Omar's son, Mullah Yaqub. All the provinces bordering Iran down south. And the eastern part, which largely borders Pakistan, are under the control of Sirajuddin Haqqani, and commanders which are considered hardliners in comparison to the group sitting in Doha. These are younger lot, or the more extreme within the Taliban, considered as people who are known to have a more hardline position and closer to the Pakistan's military establishment. So issues will come up, and there will be problems. Now, this is where the section of leadership might find itself isolated within the Taliban after a point of time. And this is going to act as a pressure on them not to make too many compromises, because they somewhere have this fear. What if some of these younger commanders, they join Islamic State and emerge as a counter force, and Pakistan too will use it as a leverage against the older leadership of the Taliban. So we are going to see these fault lines emerge, and they will sharpen as time passes by. And as you very rightly said, the problem with all these extremist organizations is they do splinter. They break into smaller groups. So we are likely to see, some of these scenarios might emerge. Let me respond to one question that was there. I think I lost track. Yeah. I've already reflected on general public. There's a sense of abandonment, and that explains why, apart from Kabul airport, we have seen thousands of Afghans, because their economy is in shambles. They know trade is not going to be. It's going to be difficult. There are no job opportunities, and foreign investments are not going to come to Afghanistan. So they all benefited from 20 years of Western or international engagement, but that all has crumbled. And it has crumbled so suddenly that it has come as a shock. Even the Taliban deputy leader in his interview said that we didn't expect such a quick victory. So somewhere definitely something went terribly wrong, and I agree with you that it was part of a larger, much broader US, Pakistan, Taliban, and perhaps some of the regional countries at some stage were part of it, because the government in Kabul was systematically marginalized, isolated, decimated. And somewhere there was this view in the provinces, let's say in the district levels, that to avoid bloodshed, because as I said, they didn't know what are they supposed to defend. Which government are they supposed to defend? Because this government somewhere lacked legitimacy in the vast rural spaces in Afghanistan. Taliban These reports had been coming since 2005 and 6 how Taliban are trying to, have control over areas around Kabul, in valleys around Kabul. They captured those towns. We hear more about provincial capitals, but if you look at the way they went about capturing districts, they were capturing those districts and towns which were strategically located along the highways that connected Kabul to the provinces, be it northern Afghanistan, be it eastern. So a systematic effort was on to cut off Kabul from all the four sides, I mean, from all the four regions of the country and isolate Kabul. So it was done with in a very systematic way. I think somewhere Afghans, armed forces and others, they got a very negative message from the US Taliban agreement, the fact that they had to release all those. They knew releasing these 5,000 would mean that there will be a surge in attacks by the Taliban across Afghanistan. They did open several fronts in northern Afghanistan, southern, eastern, western. Afghan army had taken heavy casualties all these years, and I must quickly add that army has melted away. There could be hundreds and thousands of officers or soldiers in pockets of the country at the moment. Several of the Afghan pilots, they flew their aircraft to Uzbekistan. I mean, there are rough estimates that at least 60 odd Afghan aircrafts are in Uzbekistan. And the aircraft left behind in Kabul, as we all saw, they were all, I don't know, dismantlement would not be the right word, but it's difficult for Taliban to use them. But when it comes to bases that fell to the Taliban, so a lot of weaponry did fall. But as per the reports coming from the US, most of the systems that have fallen into the hands of Taliban are categorized as low grade. So, and they require, serviceability, maintenance, etc. So there are larger questions, and there are questions of immediate concern as well. Now, what options India has? I think, as I said in my presentation, we have to deal with the situation as it is. It's a fact that Taliban are sitting in Kabul. It's a fact that we still have some of our nationals there. It's a fact that we still have thousands of Afghans in parts of, not only in Delhi, in parts of India. So, and then at the same time, we have invested $3 billion in Afghanistan. Our relations was never just about government to government, state to state. Somewhere we have established a very good relationship with the people of Afghanistan. I think it's, as I said, at some point of time, we will have to look beyond Kabul because Taliban, as I said, is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan is too big.
That's right. I think now we have reached the end of today's webinar. As I said earlier, it was a very comprehensive and very insightful lecture on the subject. And we have received many interesting questions also from the audience. And we have had a very, very interesting discussion on this subject. I think all the participants who have taken time off this afternoon to join us. And once again, I thank Dr. Vishal Chandra for accepting our invitation and delivering this lecture.
Thank you, Chair Dr. Mishra, and thank you, Nehru Memorial. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind patience and for your questions, very valid questions. And I tried to respond to most of them, but given the situation in Afghanistan, there's a lot of speculation on at the moment. But I'm sure as time passes by, the picture would be clearer and our options too would be clearer.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.